April 1944. Night over the Thames estuary. The bomber was so large that the crew felt it before they truly saw it, its mass pushing through cold air, its wings carrying a load meant to punish London one more time. Inside the cockpit, the pilot watched the engine instruments with the same intensity he watched the black horizon. The needles were climbing again, not from enemy fire, not from a flak hit, from the aircraft itself. A sharp chemical smell seeped into the cabin, the kind that made men go quiet because everyone already knew what it meant. In the right nacelle, heat pooled where it had no right to pool. Oil misted onto metal that ran too hot. A flicker appeared, small, almost timid, then snapped into a living flame. The Heinkel's great wing carried on as if nothing had happened, but the fire did not care about aerodynamics. It wanted oxygen, wiring, fuel lines, and time. The flight engineer reached for the extinguisher handle and pulled, as if yanking on a rope could drag the aircraft back from its own design. The discharge hissed. The flame dimmed. For a heartbeat, it seemed contained. Then the temperature surged again, and the fire returned, brighter, angrier, crawling along the nacelles' seams. The bomber was over England now, and it was burning. The crew could either keep the bombs and die honestly on the run, or drop everything and try to get home in a machine that had a reputation for killing its own. The pilot looked at the dark water below and made his decision. He thought the worst part would be getting out. He was wrong. This happened during Germany's late-war attempt to strike Britain again, when the Luftwaffe bled white on every front still tried to pretend it could punish the cities that Allied bombers were already leveling in the Reich. The aircraft was the Heinkel He 177 Greif, the only German heavy bomber to reach operational status in the war. A plane built to carry the load of a four-engined bomber while presenting the drag and silhouette of a twin. It was supposed to be Germany's answer to industrial air power, range, payload, speed, and teeth. Instead, it became a warning whispered on flight lines and written between the lines of maintenance reports, a big bomber that could set itself on fire without enemy help. This story was about how one aircraft became the clearest symbol of the Luftwaffe's strategic confusion, how requirements, doctrine, and engineering compromise produced a machine that promised everything and delivered fear, not to enemies below, but to the men inside it. Years earlier, long before that night over the Thames, German planners had dreamed of a bomber that could reach deep, strike hard, and return fast. An aircraft that could do what Germany's medium bombers could not. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium issued the Bomber A requirement in the mid-1930s, calling for a long-range bomber with a heavy load, a machine that belonged to a war of distance and industry. But Germany was not building that war yet. Its doctrine was still shaped by the belief that air power existed to support armies, to crack a front, to paralyze a battlefield, not to grind a rival nation down with sustained strategic bombing. And when doctrine fought with ambition, requirements became contradictions. One of the most damaging contradictions was the insistence that this heavy bomber should also be capable of steep diving attacks, an expectation that sounded daring in a conference room and looked monstrous on an engineer's drawing board. A heavy bomber strengthened for dive recovery needed structure. Structure meant weight. Weight demanded power. And Germany did not have a single reliable engine in mass production that could provide the power this bomber needed. So the solution was clever in the way that desperate solutions often were. If Germany could not produce one engine powerful enough, it would combine two. Not side by side on separate nacelles like a true four-engined bomber, but paired together inside each nacelle two V-12s geared to a single propeller shaft, coupled into what amounted to one power system. On paper it looked elegant. Fewer nacelles, less drag, higher speed, better range. In practice, it created heat, complexity, and maintenance nightmares on a scale that peacetime testing rarely forgave. Two engines crammed into one space shared exhaust paths and crowded cooling, while oil and fuel lines ran through tight compartments that were difficult to inspect and harder to service. Every leak mattered. Every loose clamp was a potential funeral. The He 177 first flew in late 1939, entering a world already sliding into total war. Test flights revealed what engineers feared. The aircraft could fly. And when everything behaved, it could be impressive fast for its size, heavy with promise. But the same flights exposed the violence hidden inside the concept. The coupled engines were temperamental. Overheating was not an inconvenience. It was a countdown. Small fires were not rare accidents. They were recurring events. Each incident left behind the same blackened smell, the same scorched panels, and the same grim jokes. Crews began to treat the nacelles with a kind of superstition. They listened for changes in pitch. They watched for the faintest whiff of burning oil. They stared at temperature gauges the way a man stares at a match near spilled fuel. Because the bomber was not failing at the margins, it was failing at the heart. The early war years passed with Germany winning quickly on land and living off the illusion that it did not need a true strategic bomber force. Medium bombers, dive bombers, and fighters carried the early campaigns. But as the war expanded, Germany's lack of range and payload became a cage. Britain remained unconquered. The Soviet Union did not collapse, and American industry entered the conflict like a rolling tide. The need for a heavy bomber returned late, urgent, and poisoned by earlier choices. The He 177 was pushed forward even as it remained unfinished, because the Reich no longer had the luxury of waiting for perfection. Then came a winter catastrophe that revealed the absurdity of improvisation at scale. By late 1942 and early 1943, the Sixth Army was trapped at Stalingrad, and the Luftwaffe tried to supply an encircled force by air an operation that devoured aircraft, crews, and fuel, while delivering too little of everything that mattered. In January 1943, He 177 were committed to this desperate airlift effort. On paper, a big bomber sounded useful. It had range, it had payload, it could carry supplies into a pocket. In reality, it was the wrong machine for the job, arriving with unreliable engines, heavy fuel consumption, and a maintenance burden that a front-line airfield could not easily bear. Only a fraction were serviceable when the moment came. Major Kurt Schade led the effort, and on an early mission into the Stalingrad cauldron, he was shot down. The airlift was not just a tragedy of logistics. It was a lesson written in wreckage. Even when Germany had a heavy bomber, it could not field it in the numbers or reliability needed to change events. And at Stalingrad, events were merciless. If Stalingrad showed the bomber's weakness under pressure, the Atlantic showed what the bomber might have been if it could be kept alive long enough to use its advantages. Out over the Bay of Biscay and the approaches to France, the war was a contest of reconnaissance, submarines, convoys, and long-range patrols. Aircraft that could reach far and carry heavy ordnance were valuable. The He 177's size and range made it a candidate for anti-shipping operations, and as guided weapons emerged, glide bombs and missiles intended to strike ships from outside the tightest flak envelopes, the heavy bomber finally seemed to have a role that fit its design. Fitted to carry the Heinkel H's 293, the OSHA 177 could, in theory, launch a guided missile from standoff distance and let the weapon do what the bomber itself might not survive at close range. A crew taking off from Bordeaux-Marignac would feel the promise of it. The aircraft rose heavy, its gear folding slowly like knees under strain. The Atlantic night below looked endless. Somewhere out there, a convoy moved like a chain of dim embers, escorted by guns and radar. The missile under the wing was not simply another bomb. It was a gamble on technology, an attempt to cheat the Allied advantage in numbers and air cover. The bomber would approach at altitude, release the weapon, and guide it toward the target, turning the aircraft, for a moment, into a launch platform rather than a brawler. But even here, the old demon remained. Before the enemy ever fired a shot, the crew would listen for the engine's mood. They would watch the temperatures rise, watch the oil pressure tremble, and wonder if the most dangerous part of the mission would happen above the runway on the way out. The He-177's evolution became a constant struggle between what it was supposed to be and what it could realistically do. Engineers added changes, better cooling arrangements, improved fire protection, revisions in the engine installation, and later a move from the DB606 to the more powerful DB610 coupled system. Some problems could be reduced, some could be managed, some could be postponed, but the aircraft never escaped the fundamental truth of its concept. It asked too much reliability from too much complexity, packed too tightly, under too much wartime strain. Mechanics hated it in a particular way, not the casual hatred of difficult work, but the weary anger of men tasked with keeping a flawed promise alive. Servicing paired engines inside one nacelle meant fighting for access. A leak that might be easy to spot on a clean design could hide, bake, and ignite. A fault could become a fire before the crew even recognized the warning. Still, the bomber entered operations because Germany needed symbols as much as it needed bombs. A heavy bomber suggested parity with the Allies. It suggested that Germany could strike back. It suggested that the Luftwaffe still had reach. But symbolism could not make spare parts appear, could not make training time stretch, could not make fuel abundant. And by 1943 and 1944, Germany was fighting a war of shrinking options. Allied bombers hit factories and rail yards. Fighter cover spread like a net. Night defenses tightened. A heavy bomber that struggled to survive its own engines now had to survive radar-guided interception, flak belts, and aggressive night fighters. That was the world that produced the night over the Thames. Operation Steinbock Germany's Baby Blitz was a late attempt to bomb Britain again, to answer destruction with destruction, even as the Luftwaffe's best years were already behind it. In those raids, heavy bombers like the He-177 carried the psychological weight of the offensive. They were meant to look like a return of force, but the reality was a parade of strained aircraft and exhausted crews. Some bombers never reached the target. Some turned back with mechanical problems. Some arrived scattered, late, and vulnerable. And some, like the Greif over the Thames, began burning from within while still in enemy airspace. Inside the He-177 on that night, the crew's world narrowed to instruments and choices. The flight engineer tried extinguishers again. The navigator recalculated headings because the aircraft could not hold the planned route at power settings that kept the temperatures under control. The radio operator listened to terse calls, other crews reporting flak, fighters, fires, forced returns. The bomber's great airframe remained steady, almost indifferent, as if it did not understand that the engines were trying to kill it. Then the night fighters arrived. A mosquito did not need to be seen to be felt. Sometimes the first sign was tracer slicing past like quicksilver. Sometimes it was the sudden vibration of evasive movement. The pilot throwing a heavy bomber into a shallow dive because there was no other way to build speed. The He-177 was not meant to dogfight. but it carried defensive guns and men who would fire them until they jammed, or the target vanished. The gunners watched for the faint shape against darker sky. They squeezed bursts into nothingness, hoping the attacker would hesitate, hoping to buy seconds. But seconds were exactly what the engine fire consumed. The pilot faced the cruel arithmetic of heavy bombers at night. Altitude gave time. Time gave options, but every minute also fed the fire. He could turn back now, while there was still control authority and hydraulic pressure and visibility. Or he could press on, drop the bombs, and fly home with a wounded aircraft wounded, not by the enemy, but by itself. He chose survival. The bomb release clunked, the aircraft suddenly lighter, as if it exhaled. The He 177 turned east, away from London, away from the flak belts tightening around the city, away from the bright mouths of searchlights. But leaving the target did not mean escaping the night. Over the coast, the bomber descended to ease engine strain and to avoid the worst of the fighter boxes. The fire in the nacelle pulsed, fed by oil and heated metal. In the cockpit, voices stayed calm because panic was contagious in a confined aluminum room. The flight engineer called out temperatures in a steady tone, like a doctor reading a patient's pulse. The navigator gave headings that avoided known defenses. The pilot kept his hands on the controls with a careful gentleness, as if rough movement would tear something loose that was still holding. At some point, the crew understood the truth. They were not merely returning from a raid. They were racing a fire toward home. Some He 107 crews won that race. They landed with scorched nacelles, engines seized, tires bursting under the weight of a heavy landing, and flames licking out as ground crews rushed in with extinguishers. Others lost. An engine fire could spread into a wing, into fuel tanks, into structural spars. In such moments, the bomber could go from controllable to doomed with terrifying speed. A crew might bail out into black water, or into fields lit only by distant burning cities, trusting parachutes more than the machine they had been ordered to fly. The He 177's tragedy was that it never fully became what it might have been. When it worked, it hinted at a Germany that had chosen a different air war, one that built true heavy bombers early, trained crews for long campaigns, and accepted the harsh mathematics of strategic bombing. But Germany did not make that choice in time. It poured resources into medium bombers and tactical support, then tried to leapfrog into heavy bombing with a machine born from contradictory demands: heavy payload and dive bombing, long range and limited drag, 2 engines that were really 4, packed into nacelles that turned heat into terror. Even production numbers could not hide the emptiness of operational reality. Around 1,000 Heinkel He were built across variants, but only a fraction were ever combat-ready at the same time, and many were lost to accidents and mechanical failures as much as to enemy action. A heavy bomber was not just aluminum and engines, it was training pipelines, spare engines, fuel allocations, bomb stocks, airfield infrastructure, and the ability to lose crews without losing the entire force's competence. The Allies could afford that brutal arithmetic. Germany could not. Every He 177 that burned on takeoff, every crew lost in a forced landing, every aircraft grounded for lack of parts was not merely a loss. It was the collapse of a promise. By late 1944, the strategic situation became even more unforgiving. Fuel shortages tightened like a noose. Allied fighters prowled over airfields. Bombing raids cratered runways and shattered factories. In such conditions, an aircraft with complicated engines and heavy maintenance demands was the last thing Germany needed. The Greif's story narrowed into scattered operations, fewer sorties, more desperate missions. There were redesign efforts ideas for proper four-engined variants that would have made the aircraft safer and more maintainable, but war does not reward late corrections. It rewards what exists now, in numbers, ready to fly. And what existed for many He-177 crews was a bomber that required courage not only against the enemy, but against the aircraft itself. After the war, the He-177's reputation hardened into nicknames and memories. A heavy bomber that promised to carry Germany into a strategic air war, yet arrived crippled by decisions made at the drafting table and in conference rooms. In the end, it served as a case study in how wars are lost by mismatched priorities. Germany wanted a heavy bomber, but insisted it behave like something else. It wanted power but refused the practical solution of 4 separate engines early enough. It wanted range and payload, without accepting that reliability and maintainability were weapons too. On that April night, if the He-177 crew made it back to France, they would taxi in under dim field lights with a nacelle blackened and blistered, the smell of burned oil hanging over the aircraft like a curse. Ground crewmen would climb up, open panels, and find the familiar signs: heat damage, leaks, scorched insulation. The bomber would sit there, huge and silent, looking like a monument to what might have been, and the men who had flown it would not talk about glory first. They would talk about the moment the smell began, the moment the temperature spiked, the moment they realized they were fighting a fire at altitude, with England below, and the enemy almost incidental. The Greif was supposed to be Germany's long reach. Instead, it became Germany's warning. Not that a heavy bomber was impossible, but that a heavy bomber built on contradictions could become more dangerous to its own crews than to its targets. It was a machine that carried the weight of strategy without the foundation to support it. And in the end, it burned sometimes over enemy cities, sometimes over friendly fields, sometimes over nothing but darkness, leaving behind a lesson as stark as any wreck on a runway. Power without reliability was only another way to fall.